Right, we're good to go. All right. Very good. Myself on camera. Good evening, everybody. My name is Earl Fleury. I represent the Brooklyn Long Island Alumni Chapter of Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity Incorporated. We welcome you to this we welcome to our Real Talk series of Educational Civil Liberties, Understanding the Foundation of the U.S. Constitution as we get ready for the year 2025. I turn this over to our moderator, Danielle Henry, who will continue on the panel, and we will start introducing the panel members in the next few minutes. Danielle, you can take over from here.
Thank you, Earl. Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Danielle Henry. I have a specialization in organization and leadership psychology. And joining me in this wonderful, riveting discussion about the U.S. Constitution are our following panelists. Dr. Gloria J. Brown Marshall, who is a professor in LPS and affiliated professor in Africana Studies at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, CUNY. Mr. Jason Richburg, 15th Legislative District, Suffolk County, Long Island, New York. Dr. Nadia E. Brown. Professor Dr. Nadia E. Brown is a professor of government and chair of the Women's and Gender Studies program at Georgetown University. Mr. Temedeo Aganga Williams, Esquire, partner at Selendi Gay, PLLC in New York, New York. And council member Sylvina Brooks Powers, Majority Whip, New York City Council, representing Queens, New York. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us for this wonderful discussion we're going to have this evening. It's a pleasure to have you all here. To our audience out on Facebook land and YouTube, this is an introduction overall to making you understand the education and civil liberties of the main infrastructure that our country has been built on, which is the United States Constitution. The first question I'm going to open up with, which is open to everyone, is based more so on a historical context in really understanding the United States Constitution. And that question is as follows. What were the main influences on the framers of the Constitution when drafting the Constitution? Anyone can take it.
So I would say, and thank you to Earl and thank you to our moderator, Dr. Henry, Jason Richburg, Minority Leader of Suffolk County Legislature, and legislator for 15th District. I would say part of it was Greece, right? Some of the early Greece and Rome were one of the early conversations. Also, the Magna Carta were part of it. To create a republic, a democratic republic, it was unknown in the modern world, right? And so I think there was a strategy first with the Articles of Confederation to have separate states without a federalized control, and they realized that didn't work, almost to an early civil war, and so they created a federalized system to unite, because we had 13 colonies with 13 different monetary systems, and everybody was sort of doing things their own way, and so there had to be a way to hybridize, for lack of a better word, a system where you could have individual systems within states and then have a nationalized system to regulate interstate commerce, because one of the issues was that there were tariffs. I know we're talking about tariffs today, but one of the issues is that New Jersey and New York were charging tariffs in between each other. And there was tariffs between Virginia and I think it was Virginia and the Carolinas. And then there was border taxes as well. So I think, and I know there's some folks probably a little bit more learned than I am who could probably go into greater detail, but I think that was the beginning.
I was going to turn it over to Dr. Brown because
Yeah.
you have a very rich background from a historical context as it pertains to the United States Constitution. Dr. Brown.
Yes, thank you for putting this together, Earl and Danielle, and thank you, Legislator Richburg, for starting us off. Right, so agreed, right? The main influences of how the framers thought about the Constitution were on these other ancient systems of democracy. But they came to this from having lived through two failed governments, right? It failed in their eyes. The first is the monarchy as British subjects as part of the original 13 colonies. And the second was the Articles of Confederation. And so, to the framers' mind, the Constitution was the best of both worlds, from things that they liked and understood that they needed to have in the monarchy, which was a strong executive. And then having what they liked from the Articles of Confederation was having the deliberative process where legislative body could meet and try to represent the needs of individual states through a collective process. But what both the monarchy and the Articles of Confederation did not have expressly was an opportunity for the three branches of government to come together to provide equal representation to people. And so under the federal system that the Constitution enables us is that power lies with the people, and the people are able to elect the state and local representatives as well as the federal government that is responsive to the people. And so unlike the monarchy or the Articles of Confederation, there was this middleman, right, that people didn't have as much interaction with or free reign to express their feelings about politics and policy. Now, again, I want to just put a pin here to know that we, the people, in this instance means propertied white male. So this is not universal, but this is the factors. These are the factors that led to this expanded democracy that was based off of this Greek and then later Roman model.
Thank you.
I'd just like to add a few points. This has been, brilliant. When we talk about the rebellion, as was raised previously, and trying to sustain a government, Shays' Rebellion has taken place in Massachusetts. And we were operating under the Articles of Confederation, where each state, as was pointed out, had its own currency, had its own ability to have treaties with other nations, was actually having its own military. And so we were in a point of conflict in Massachusetts when you think of a bankruptcy court being a state court. So you have these people who have, Shay and others who have fought in the Revolutionary War, and they were supposed to get this money, and they were farmers, and they weren't. And then they would have foreclosure on their property, and the state bankruptcy judge would take over and they take the property. And so these people rose up, led by Daniel Shay, and you had this war. It's a civil war that was taking place, and bloodshed. They're burning down the courthouses. They're doing all this thing. And they say, okay, where is the federal government? Oh, in Philadelphia. Well, come and save us. The federal government is so weak. It can't do anything. It doesn't. And they're tired. Why would they fight for the federal government, what they call the head of government at that time under the Articles of Confederation? If they didn't pay the other soldiers, why should they pay these? And so they said, we're not going to go all the way to Massachusetts to fight. And then the rich people decided to get insurgents of their own. So they have mercenaries to fight on their side. It would have been a complete, total mess. And so they knew that having a weak federal government, central government, was not going to work. And that having each state being the weakest link, depending on their military, that any outsider invader could come in. And so when the Federalist Papers, when they wrote those, and it's, and spoke of these three major issues dealing with outside forces, sustaining the government economically, and how do we protect ourselves and maintain this an economy that's based on all of the states, and as was pointed out, the balance of power between the states and the federal government, this federalism. So all these concepts also was taken into account. We have to say the indigenous nations and the forms of government they had, something, because Thomas Jefferson studied all these different governments, but he also studied the indigenous governments as well. And so when we look at our Constitution, it really doesn't have any, I won't say really doesn't, it does not have any individual rights. So James Madison, who says that, he's the father, or they claim he's the father. I don't know who the mother of the U.S. Constitution is, but the father is James Madison. He promises we'll have these individual rights and they'll come in the form of the next document. If you promise to follow my lead and ratify this document, then we will have a document that protects you from the very government you just created. And that document would become the Bill of Rights. And so that's why they're called the amendments, because they're changes. To amend is to change. So they're changes to this Constitution. But the Constitution itself was the structure of the government, the role and responsibilities of the within the three branches of government, stating in there can be no kings. We can have no kings, no prince. All those things are stated. That's why it's not a coincidence we don't have a king or a prince or a duke or earl. It's stated that we cannot have those titles and be in government.
Because of past experience.
Yes. And so what we see then in the Bill of Rights is almost a post-traumatic stress disorder document in which all that happened under the monarchy, they said, well, we don't want to have these searches, without any protection. So that's why we have a Fourth Amendment search and seizure protection. So you have all these protections in the First Amendment, of course, with protections that were promised to protect us from having the government that had abused those, what considered to be abusive of those issues before. And in reading the Declaration of Independence with that in mind, you see there's a lot on the economy and, making money in the Declaration of Independence, and what the individual states would be allowed to do and the powers that the people would have. And so when you look at the Constitution and then go to the amendments, you see how they spoke to those issues of concerns that were raised primarily first in the Declaration of Independence.
Thank you so
But
much.
Dr. Brown Marshall, so I would add to that is that fear, right? Fear was the biggest thing, right? They were so scared of that strong government. They were so scared of folks being quartered in folks' houses and taking over property that they wanted to make sure that there were things put in to protect that. And that's why the Articles of Confederation were so weak, because again, of fear.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for your input, because it also, in essence, answers another question that I had in regards to the significance of the separation of powers in order to effectively prevent tyranny. From what I'm hearing in the space is that we have all of these pieces of information that was developed originally and then developed over time to try to address changes within our society. But has it been effective in preventing tyranny?
But
I think sorry.
Go ahead,
Councilperson, please go ahead.
Yes, please, council member. Yes, please. I want to hear,
I'm so sorry. I just wanted to say, that's such a timely question, right? And right, so the outcome of the recent election, no shade, but in all seriousness, the significance of the separation of powers to really ensure that as we know, no single branch of government has unchecked authority. When you look at even the city council, the New York City Council, we often have that exercise between the legislative aspect of the city government and the executive branch. And at times we have to flex those reflective muscles that are not always worked out, because I think that there is, in certain instances, moments where it has failed, in a sense, to protect certain constituencies from feeling that there's no separation of powers in terms of how it operates. And so there's tremendous significance in the separation of powers. But the way in which to effectively prevent it is to make sure that we continue to do checks on our system, right? Making sure we do civic engagement like what we're doing right now. Making sure we are encouraging people. Don't just focus on one aspect of government. Don't just focus on the president that's up here. Focus on all the other components that help to make government work and work well. And that's the true path to ensuring that we don't have tyranny.
I definitely want, Mr. Aganga Williams, I saw you unmute yourself and I was going to call you out because I definitely want to hear your thoughts on this based on your wealth of knowledge and expertise.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have the academic background that so many of our
It's all good, but you have real life experience.
speaking as from my experience, and I was, on the January 6th committee and investigating that attack there.
Yes.
And I'm a practicing lawyer and I was a prosecutor. And, I think one thing when I hear this conversation that I, in my head, keep coming back to is that from which perspective are we speaking about in each time period? And I think, Dr. Brown, I think you referenced that or noted that earlier. And I think whether we're talking about from the inception of our Constitution or to the present day, from large swaths of our communities, I think from that perspective, we were not, separation of powers was not working, or that we didn't have a democracy, or that there was not representation. For a lot of our country's history, right, obviously Black people as a group were institutionally oppressed and not allowed to participate in any of these systems. So I do think as we have this discussion as to whether or not the framers' structure, not only is it upheld, but how do we judge it throughout time? I think it's really important to kind of narrow down on whose perspective we're talking about and whether the system worked. Because if you go to Jim Crow, I don't know that you say that the American experiment is working well. If you look at the Black Code, I don't know you said the American experiment is working well. If you look at any time prior to early 1970s, I don't know that you say the American experiment is working particularly well. So I think that's, and when we talk about, I think about the present day and the recent election results and what happened on January 6th, I do think we are seeing an erosion of not only the trust in institutions, but the belief in the need for a separation of powers, or the belief in a representative democracy, or the belief that we should not be led by an authoritarian style of government. And I think what's going to be really interesting as we look over the next 4 years is that if the Trump administration does what so many of us think is possible and likely, which is to see the continued centralization of power in the executive branch, increased use of force against domestic opponents and political violence, are these institutions as strong as people think they are? When I look at January 6th, I've said a lot of times, I don't think institutions were as strong as people think they are. I think we still have an American democracy now, not necessarily by design, but because pure luck. If things had happened as they were close to happening on January 6th, we would have had the mass murder, I think, of members of Congress on national television. So I think it's really important when we talk about the strength of our Constitution to see how much of it perhaps may be luck and not design.
I love that. Thank you.
So the point I wanted
Professor
to raise
Brown Marshall,
before,
thank you.
Yes, the point I wanted to raise before when it was mentioned about fear, and then this really taps into what was just said. We were the object of the fear. The indigenous were the object of the fear, as well as outside invaders. And so when we start to look at this question from what perspective, I mean, for this, we have always, as W.B. Du Bois pointed out, had this double bind where on the one hand, we speak as Americans, and on the other hand, we speak as those who have been oppressed by America, but who live in America. And so I think when we look at the Constitution, and I know I raise this point, it doesn't get spoken too often. We're looking at the framers, and that's what they call the people, for those out and listening, that's what they call the people who met in 1787 in Philadelphia to create the US Constitution. They framed it, so everyone had a contribution. This is important because so many people believe that all of those framers were slaveholders, and they weren't. There were, of course, the majority slaveholders from slaveholding states, but there were also those who were abolitionists in the room as well. And that's why you have a provision in the Constitution that says by 1808, the slave trade is going to end. Now, in Great Britain, the slave trade ended in 1807, and slavery ended as well. The slave trade ended in 1808 for us, but slavery continued. And so if it was just all of these people as slave holders, they never would have ended slavery. But also within the Constitution, you have fugitive slave clauses, where if someone ran from slavery within the Constitution itself, then you can bring them back to the slaveholder. That's in the Constitution.
Yes.
So we have these concerns as a nation, but it is true. We must think about from whence are we speaking, and for whom are we speaking? We are talented and educated enough to speak about the Constitution to any group, but we are speaking primarily to groups of African Americans or people of African descent.
Right.
And so I think it is something that we have to clarify, that generally, yes, we're talking about the Constitution and what it does and what it's supposed to do. But in particular, women didn't gain the right to vote until 1920. So even
white women,
including white women.
specifically. I mean,
But, no,
I mean, it was everybody, but
no, but all women gained the right to vote. This is what I want to clarify. All women gained the right to vote, but it's through racist laws and violence.
yeah,
that right was not able to be executed by people of color.
That's right. So thank you for that. And I mean, everyone on this panel are bringing up some great insight and calling out some things, because as we continue the conversation, we are focusing on how the Constitution primarily affects the Black community, the connectivity. Which leads me to my next question, which Professor Brown Marshall set it up so nicely, which is like, what was the impact of the 3/5 compromise on the political power of the Black community, especially in the early United States? Professor Brown Marshall, you kind of touched on that, how this setup really affected how the overall laws and what's been in place for amendments, hindered the Black community. Like,
and I'm going to open up, and I'm sure everyone has
Yep.
something to add to this. So I'm just going to do 2 quick points.
Yep.
One, when I was researching this at the Library of Congress, I asked at the time, why 3/5? Why not 2/3? Not why 1/8? And they said they had used the fraction 3/5 for something else earlier. So they said, well, let's just stay with 3/5. So that's why it's 3/5 of a person in the 3/5 clause. The other part of this is because just as we have people incarcerated today, and those incarcerated people are considered part of the population, to determine the number of Congress people in the House of Representatives, it was thought even then we need the population to determine the number of people who will represent that district, that state in Congress. But they're not going to deliver on any promises. They're not going to work to help those people who are part of the population. They're just for political expediency. And so they counted in the slave states, of course, in the southern states, and that's why the South had so much political power for so long, because they counted in the population. For example, South Carolina, the majority of the population was of African descent, whether free or enslaved. And so they used those numbers in order to have political power, but it wasn't as though they represented those people in any way when they went to Congress. And so that 3/5 compromise was something that gave them political power and undermined our abilities to actually execute even those free African and Americas. And I want to make sure, this is the second point, to know that politically, there have been free people of African descent since at least the 1600s.
Correct.
And we talk about Mary and Anthony Johnson, an Angolan couple, among other Africans who were, part of that population. We know that the 20-odd Africans arriving in August of 1619 into the Virginia colony. And so you have the no legalized slavery then, but it also means that there have been free Africans that should have had their property ownership, as Dr. Brown has pointed out, that property ownership should have given them political power. And what they would do is change the law. So it was always 2 steps forward, 1 step back, because they had, whites had the political power, and they also had the incentive to maintain a labor class that would allow them to continue to make money for free. And so even though we had free people of African descent, they still didn't have the political power. So the 3/5 rule for the enslaved and the undermining of the political power for the free always meant that we were not able to have full power within this country for most, as was pointed out, most of the time that we've been here.
Thank you.
I just want to add and add
Yes,
for
please.
everything that Professor Brown Marshall just shared. But when you think about the 3/5 clause, it is like an unfortunate reminder of the give and take early on in the history of this nation. And it's something that, as the good professor shared, gave power to these southern states, but what it did was it really solidified the dependence on slavery for a
Yes.
much longer period of time.
Yes.
As a result, because it gave the incentive economically in terms of what that did to their communities, but also in terms of representation in government. But one could say, if you want to look at the glass half full, half empty in this dynamic, we could also argue that it was the precursor that set the stage for the civil rights and all of the other type of moments in history that led us to make those steps forward. But it is an unfortunate reminder of the give and take and how the Black population in particular was viewed as less than, to the point that they were more considered still at that moment property, when you were talking about representation. So that's something to also take into account.
And as council member Brooks has said, and I know we had the same political science professor at Wilberforce, so I'm sure he want us to remember that it goes back to that old adage, right? If you're not at the table, you're on the menu, right? And so we were on the menu. And so while there was our government, and I know we all have fear about what's going on, but I think what's important is that there is always a rebalancing. That rebalancing is difficult and it's not always clear, right? The Civil War happened, and then there was Reconstruction. Reconstruction was a rebalancing, and then there was a recorrection of the rebalancing with the Jim Crow and the Black Codes, and then there was the Civil Rights Movement, right? So there's always a rebalancing act. What is the most important thing, and I will go to the New York State Constitution, is education. Because in the New York State Constitution, there's guaranteed education rights for everyone. And so many of the folks who were in the room when the U.S. Constitution was written made sure that education was in our Constitution. And why that is important is because education is a tool to get everyone further. And the 3/5 compromise, as you're right, it's an unfortunate reminder of compromise. But it's important to understand that we need to educate ourselves and others, like panels like this, so we don't have to have that compromise going forward. And we can capitalize on the different balances of power. That's why the different judges that President Biden has appointed over the last couple of days is so important.
Well, they were
right?
appointed
Because
since last fall, and I can attest for that. My cousin is one of them.
but that's why though, but recent, it's all
It's still
important because
recent. It all happened in the past like 2 years. So yeah.
right. And it's because it's important to have those folks in the seats. It's important to have those folks to make those negotiations and to oversee those cases. And I'll leave my comments.
But this is a great segue. Dr. Brown, do you have something you wanted to add to this? Because I'm going to segue into something that we just that everyone has just touched on, which is about civil rights and equal protection. Because this is an expanse from the 3/5 compromise. We are now moving into the next sphere of influence of the U.S. Constitution, and as it even ties into even further to the Bill of Rights. And the question I have for the panel is as follows. What are the constitutional arguments for and against affirmative action, and how they have affected Black communities?
I'm sorry, I missed the part of the question. Can you repeat it?
What are the constitutional arguments for and against affirmative action, and how have they affected Black communities?
That's another really good and timely topic right there. And
Well, y'all brought it in. Y'all were talking about
and I misspoke.
rights.
I didn't mean to say civil rights. I meant to say Civil War, but in terms of civil rights, since we're here, welcome. So recently we've seen a lot of rollbacks happening. One of which being affirmative action. Now, one would argue with affirmative action, the downside is the fact that it locks out communities of color from certain opportunities. I remember years ago, there was this cartoon that talked about equality and equity, and it showed like the people next to each other, but it showed the person that had much more of a deficit to operate from, needing to be like stand on a couple of books to really be leveled out with the person beside them. And when we think about our institutions and how deeply systemic the discrimination that exists really are, one would argue that we need to have affirmative action. Well, the outcome in the rollback has been, let's look at education, because my special Jason spoke about education. The enrollment in terms of a lot of the PWIs for people of color has significantly seen a decline. However, in HBCUs, which I am a proud product of, has seen a great increase. So it really depends, again, glass half full, half empty, how you look at it. Because as a product of an HBCU, while the resources were not equal to my friends that may have gone to a PWI, the love, the intention, the education that I received was unmatched and positioned me with the confidence and the education to be able to go into society and be successful. So some people, I think, would argue, especially when I talk to some of our more seasoned folks that have experienced a life where the Black community has thrived and kind of had their own innocence. And there are some people that will argue it's better. But the reality is, when we look at the society today in a global world, especially, I don't think it's harmful to have affirmative action policies, because we know and we cannot be blind to the fact that there are systemic barriers that exist in every corner of our society right now. Whether it's education, whether it's employment, whether it's housing, all of these things still exist. And if we're honest about it and acknowledge it, I think you would see more people advocating for affirmative action.
So I just wanted, go ahead.
No.
I think the question was about, I think from the legal perspective, how I think about the pro and con for affirmative action. I mean, I think it's really about how do you interpret the meanings of the 14th Amendment. So the court says 14th Amendment protects, it's whether you look at the 14th Amendment in a post-Reconstruction view as trying to bring Black people specifically up to parity and provide certain groups of people equity in our society, or you look at it at the way the conservative Supreme Court recently did when it knocked down affirmative action and says that, no, it's about basically being colorblind, that you cannot discriminate against anyone on the basis of race. So I think that's when we look at, I think, the liberal versus conservative wings, for lack of a better term, they are looking at this Constitution and looking at it, I think, either within a historical context, the way the liberals would say, that to understand what the words mean, that to have a living Constitution, you need to understand not only what the words meant when the framers said it, or whoever passed those amendments, but also how it impacts the society that we live in now. I think if you look at the conservative approach, it is a kind of it's a more robotic approach, right? It's they believe the words say what they mean, and when you say no discrimination or whatever on the basis of race, that's what it means. So I think that's how I think about it from the legal perspective. As far as the substantive argument for affirmative action, I mean, I think that's just like a policy debate. I mean, I'm pro affirmative action, but I don't know that I have any more expertise than anyone else to weigh in on that. I think what's challenging about making that policy discussion in a public policy sense is that there's been a lot of increase in perceived, I would say, white grievance. As we increase the language of equity, there has been a backlash. And that goes whether you're talking about race, you're talking about sexual orientation, you're talking about trans issues. And I do think one discussion that is going to be a difficult one to have is that, you know, the right won the last election. And I think what that means in that as we try to build coalitions that are supportive of equity, does that mean that the left has to change the language the left uses going forward, right? There's a lot of folks who we've all known since 2020, we have the language of DEI, the language of diversity, the language of equity. We speak differently a lot of times. We are very keyed in on language, and there's been a backlash to all that language. I mean, I saw someone the other day get upset because someone said unhoused, and they kind of go like, there you go again with your like liberal language. And so I do think an interesting discussion for coalition building is whether there has to be a kind of reckoning to how do you, in the face of a coming Trump administration, how does the language of diversity and equity and all these things that we've grown so comfortable with since 2020, how does that change going forward to build a coalition that's actually going to matter and have power?
I think that's an excellent point, and I think that what I would add is that we should be looking at equitable opportunity, not equitable outcomes, and it's differentiating the difference between those two, right? Understanding that there are some areas that have better opportunity, right? Let's say access to clean water, right? There are some communities, native communities around our nation that don't have access to clean water. They don't have water systems that go through their neighborhood. Is that fair compared to someone, let's say, in Queens, right? No offense, council member, but I'm just going to bring you up, right? There are whole counties in our nation that don't have health care. They, especially during 2020, when you talk about access to equal opportunity, there are counties in our country that do not have hospitals, right? So when you talk about equitable opportunity, you're removing that opportunity. And so I think you're 100% right, Dr. Agaga Williams, you know, making sure that we are so laser focused on the language that we use and understanding how we bring that parity for all and not some.
So perhaps they can be a bit provocative or controversial, but
We're here for it. Go ahead.
So the questions that we were given, or kind of the directives from today's panel, was centered on the Constitution and then trying to bring some of the constitutional standards and outlook into this 21st century.
Yeah.
And a lot of what we've been talking about in the last two questions, I think, have veered a bit from the Constitution and have moved over into laws and policy making, which is a worthwhile and, you know, much needed conversation, right? Because this is where we're living in today's present day. But I think it's important to note, as marginalized people, where we sit in relationship to the Constitution. So Professor Brown Marshall gave us an excellent background on the 3/5 compromise. And the underlying part of this, right, is that African Americans, or people of African descent in the United States, are counted as 3/5 of, or for representation purposes, right, are counted as 3/5 But it's really clear, right, that the framers of the Constitution, while they were doing so, although the majority were not slaveholders, there has always been a differential between who is seen as human and who is seen as property. And so at the heart of the Constitution is differences between who is seen as people that are thinking, people that are capable of making their own autonomous decisions and contributing to society on their own merits. And therefore, they are allowed to enter into the polity as decision makers, and those that are not. And so for a host of people that are seen as others for a variety of reasons, right? So for women, right, they are too emotional, and because they have menstrual cycles, their brains don't have the blood capacity to allow them to function and think the way that men do, right? And so this is why women didn't have voting rights, even in Greek democracy, nor in Roman democracy, right? The multiracial or the expanded a part of democracy has been because the Constitution has expanded to enable other groups that were outside of who the framers thought were legitimate body holders, legitimate people on legitimate bodies and legitimate making spaces to now make room. But these have all happened through the amendment process and also through laws, right? So we could talk about the Civil Rights Act, we could talk about the Voting Rights Act, which I think that we will later on in our conversation. We've been talking now about affirmative action, right? None of these things are enshrined in our Constitution, nor are full access to thinking about equity and inclusion. These are amendments, these are addendums on. So what I like to tell my students is, if you're thinking about, buying a house, and the first thing you do when you walk in, you think, walk around and you say, will this fit my needs? Is it close to where I need it to be? Or they have the amenities that I want? And you might even start, picking out new curtains. But if you don't go first to look at the foundation in the basement, it doesn't matter how pretty the curtains are. It doesn't matter how nice the stainless steel appliances are, because the house is shaky, right? It's not on good foundation. And so you can put in all the fancy upgrades, you could spend a lot of money, it could be the most beautiful looking house on the block, but it doesn't mean that it's the best structural house on the block. And that, God forbid, there's a natural disaster, there's an earthquake, there's a flood, something happens and the house falls to shambles with all your beautiful drapes, carpets, stainless steel appliances on the inside. And so the part that I think our colleagues have been talking here are moving us forward into a space that assumes that we've gone back and we fixed the foundation. It assumes that we've gone back and we put up scaffolding and we've readjusted the levels in the house. But in actuality, what we've done through this democratic process is just add new curtains. And so, yes, we're getting ready to talk about this Trump administration, which doesn't even want the new curtains, right? They don't even want to pretend that we're going to make this democracy opening and inclusive. Right? And we know that in 2050, the United States will be a majority country. We're not talking about a multiracial democracy. It doesn't matter in some ways the words that we're going to use, because what our start of our foundation was, the framers didn't want to have the conversation about enslavement. Dr. Brown Marshall was correct, right? We punted that one. The framers put that one down the line. They said, well, y'all 2 generations from now can go and talk about the slavery issue. We know we're going to outlaw slavery, but what are you going to do with the free Black people that are still living here? Sending them to Liberia? What we're going to, as Liberia? Are they going to be able to go to your schools? Are they going to be able to, have any kinds of reparations for the free labor that built this country? Those are conversations that the framers did not want to have intrinsically, right? Because they couldn't get through their own mindset and their own limitations of thinking about people of African descent as people. Then,
I was going to say as people.
Yeah, period. Full stop. Mic drop, right, as people. And this, right, is at the same time that the America as a democracy is forming, and other parts of the nations. Oh, sorry, I'm in a classroom because I locked myself out. Sorry. You probably do. Okay, sorry. I got locked out of my office. I left my key at home. So I finished teaching and I stayed in this classroom. And now there's someone coming in because they need this classroom. So I'm going to go on mute and find a new classroom. But I'm still here. Sorry.
Well, you open this up so beautifully. All of you have, and I'm going to add these points
Thank you.
One, it's, you know, we can tap dance around the language all we want. We can keep changing the words all we want. It's not about, and she summed it up very well. It's not about the language. What the language, that the argument is for those people in the middle who want to have a conversation where communication is there and available. That's where you talk about language. But when you get to the point, as was pointed out, and it's not just 2050, it's 2045, this country will be majority people of color. And we are sitting at a spot right now in which the mechanisms of apartheid are being put in place. And so that's why, yes, it's a policy discussion, but it's also a constitutional discussion. Because I do not believe, having been interacting with U.S. Supreme Court justices as press, as people who follow the court, as someone, a legal commentator, and I was around to hear the conversations about originalism and what it meant and what it didn't mean, and what they want is to stay in positions of power. They can call it originalism all they want. And I'll tell you this, even when it comes to Clarence Thomas, who's talking about originalism in the gun case and saying, oh, during that time period, Americans had guns. You couldn't have a gun, Negro. My thing is, and I'm sorry to put it like this, but let's be very clear.
It's true, though. It's true. It's true. He is a Black man.
People of African descent could not have guns during that period easily. And he could not have been married to his white wife in Virginia and lived there. We need to understand, and let's, because and that's why I asked in the very beginning, are we talking about the Constitution generally? Because I can have that conversation. I've read books on the Constitution.
I mean, there are pieces where there are general touch points, but we need to focus how it ties with the Black.
We need to be clear. And as the council person talked about, HBCUs, my brother went to Morehouse, I went to a PWI. The point is about choice. Where do we choose it? Do you still have choice? So when we start talking about affirmative action and the interpretation of the 14th Amendment, that was created to give us citizenship at birth, to give us due process and equal protection and privileges and immunities. That was created for us. And that's because Black men and women, but majority Black men, fought in the Civil War. Frederick Douglass said it's the ballot or the bullet. Even though the white suffragettes did not want Black men to have their right to vote before the white women did, Black men did receive that right to vote in 1870 with the 15th Amendment, because they had earned it. As Lincoln said, without the Black soldiers, the newly freed or those who had escaped, the North would have lost. We earned our place. So we need to understand our cases that we brought before the U.S. Supreme Court, won them, lost them, whatever. Our force of nature put the conscience into the Constitution. That very document we just talked about was about sustaining this nation, fending off outside invaders. Of course, they circled and came back in 1812, but also the business aspect of it. It was not about individual rights. So we took that 14th Amendment and we carved out of it the rights that we have, and then those other people also receive those rights. These aren't just Black rights. Every time we expanded individual rights through the cases we brought using the 14th Amendment, it expanded rights for all others as well.
That is correct, yes.
And so my concern then, to have them circle back and have the disingenuous notion, as Chief Justice Roberts says, oh, to stop discrimination, all you have to do is stop discriminating. We see that this is, and I say disingenuous, because any person watching any aspect of American life, as is pointed out, will see that discrimination has been a part of this, this country, is fabric of this country. Other countries, it might be religion. It might be ethnicity. Every country has something. Ours is the racial issue. So,
a racial issue that we do not want to really have a full-blown conversation about.
Why would one have a conversation? I had to say this to someone the other day who was in a white male in position of power. You want me to chase you to have a conversation. So when we're talking about changing our language, You're talking about chasing down someone. We are worthy allies, seeking worthy allies. And if there was more of a relationship between the Black elite and the rest of the Black community, we would actually have a better sense of our power, as opposed to thinking once we're in the room, if we use the right language and we're nice enough, yes, individually, we may have, promotion, we may have titles, we may have all of that, but our power is in the connectedness between all the different classes within this country coming together as we move ahead. And at this point, many people are looking at us and saying, why should we help you? So if we don't rely on each other, we're going to be in real dismal straits based on a constitution that's forever telling us we have rights as citizens and denying those rights on every turn.
Dr. Brown, I knew you were about to unmute yourself.
No, I agree with all. I agree.
I do too.
And one, so today I taught about immigration, and one of the things that our conversation came back around to for my students was on the right, or thinking about citizenship as a right versus citizenship as a privilege. And the privilege means that you have to work for citizenship, right? That you have to do something to earn it, to be worthy of citizenship, right? And this is really through that neoliberal turn that we see, right, really taking hold during the Reagan administration. But we know through the 14th Amendment, right? And we know through the 13th Amendment that citizenship is birthright, that it should not necessarily mean that you have to do something to earn it. But because we live in a white Christian nationalist state, right, those that don't live up to the markers of that identity are always in a process of trying to prove that they are good enough, that they are worthy, that they have done something exemplary that allows them to earn citizenship. And in some ways, right, it's easier to teach that through this lens post-election, right, looking at Latinos and kind of how that split went down for those that voted for Harris and those that voted for Trump, and some of the like kind of the language around being a good immigrant, being a worthy immigrant versus, someone who is doing some, less criminal, doing some things that are less desirable, like criminality, or having these, what they called, right, these anchor babies. But all of that is moot, right? When we know that the Constitution gives those that are born in the United States citizenship through birthright citizenship. And so if we can rethink about what do you have to do in order to be worthy of citizenship in a country whose constitution says that there's birthright citizenship, it helps us, I think, to frame the question in another way, to look at, well, who don't we question birthright citizenship for? We don't say that those who are phenotypically white, that those who are who adhere to the Christian faith, right, that these people can't be citizens. But we have all the ways in which minoritized communities must say that they earn it, that they are legitimate citizens. And so if we frame the question in a way that puts points the finger back at white America, I think it helps to show how these questions that we're having post-election about minoritized groups really says more about the enduredness of white supremacy and capitalism than it does anything else.
Thank you.
I do think it's notable, though, that the Trump administration is planning, the incoming administration planning efforts to undermine the concept of birthright citizenship.
Yes.
One thing, to introduce an idea that I think I've always kind of held, I think a lot of what any system of government amounts to me is the balance between just an exercise of raw power, and then folks who are willing to relinquish raw power and share that power. And I do think that's often the balance I think we're seeing in with the American Constitution. And I think for so often we often wrap it around with beautiful ideas and novel and all this talk of, like we've had now. But I do think when I look at the conservative majority now on the Supreme Court, I see raw power at work. When I look at the Dobbs decision, rolling back women's right reproductive rights. I see raw power at work. And one thing I think is really that I'm not even sure as I look at this country now is how much of this country really has really just been mostly raw power at work against the powerless, and how much of this country is actually bending, an arc bending towards justice. Because I think, and speaking from my age, I think I look at Obama, I would say prior to this election, Obama, I think, so much defined how my coming of age view of American politics somewhat, right? I came of age in like Bush, yes, but Obama kind of defined to me this kind of bend towards justice, that America is on a train in one direction and almost inevitably. Yes, it may be painful. And I think the legislator spoke earlier about the swings, but with the implication that we're swinging one way overall.
Mhm.
I think that when I'm starting to like let the Trump, era marinate on me again, unfortunately, there is an idea like maybe that's just all nonsense, right? This idea that we are bending towards justice is sure, in a broad sense, all of the world is less violent. All of human history is better now than it was 1,000 years ago. But the idea that America is inevitably going one way versus the other, I don't know that that's so much supported by the facts. And I think we, in our view of American exceptionalism, want to believe that. We want to believe that we are special. We want to believe that the framers accomplished something different with the Constitution. And I'm saying they didn't. I'm just saying that in real time now, we're still talking about an experiment that is quite young for the purposes of history. And we're looking in with Trump coming into power now, there's a world where Obama looks more and more perhaps like an aberration and not a paradigm shift.
Right.
And all of a sudden, what looks more normal very quickly is a world where you have Trump for 4 years, perhaps more. You have, and then you add another 4 years, all of a sudden, all liberal progress in American history is nothing but an aberration. You look at the court now, in my lifetime, we probably will never see a liberal court again. That's very possible that you would stay with a conservative court for my lifetime. And they're just warming up. I mean, in the Dobbs decision, they talked about getting rid of gay marriage. They have that's in the concurrence there, right? So there's a
Yes.
whole lot that they are just starting. And I think we may be facing a world that all these, the liberal court from the 60s, all these decisions and Gideon and all these things that we consider like Miranda that are like, oh, as a lawyer, it feels good. All those things may just be little aberrations. Obama may be just an aberration. And what's really happening is everything else becomes just the American paradigm that goes back to what we perhaps don't want it to be.
Thank you.
Yes.
No, go ahead, Professor
No,
Brown
I'm
Marshall,
just saying
because
yes.
if I could tap and be like, yes.
Yes. That's what I'm saying. Yes. Thank
Yeah.
you. I let the angels sing, hallelujah, my young brother. Yes.
Yeah.
And that was the problem leading into this, trying to convince people, yes, the African American force was what was bending the arc toward justice. If you go back and you start looking at this, not just African Americans, we brought the majority of cases in civil rights. In my book, Race, Law, and American Society, you can read about those cases over hundreds of years. So, but other groups, of course, the labor movement, these different groups were part of forcing the arc to bend toward justice. It didn't just happen. And that's why the concern is with the individualism and the elitism within the Black community. We cannot afford it. Yes, it's human. We cannot afford it. We cannot afford to have people immigrate into this country and have this sense of, this is a great house, going back to the example that was given before. This is a great house, and not ask who built it. And what was the sacrifice made for us to have this home? And so my concern is, when you even look at the decisions of the late 1950s into the 60s, early 70s, you begin to see the backlash coming into the conservatism of the court with Justice White and others with the law and order. Why? When we have Terry versus Ohio, for example, that gave a stop and frisk, that came on the heels of the riots from the assassination of Martin Luther King. And they're saying, oh, the police officers need more power and authority. And so we're going to have to give them more power and authority. You start to see so much that happened within that 12-year period we call the civil rights era of cases. And it would look as though it's an aberration now. But to get that took 2.5 generations. And then once we had it, people sat down as though we've now made it, we're fine, let's just follow our own individual dreams without thinking of the collective. And the African-American experience, the progress is made is through the collective. And it doesn't mean we're all in it. And that's why my book coming out in April is the protest history of the United States, to look at protest, because the Declaration of Independence is a protest document.
Yes.
And so when you start looking at protests from the standpoint of who was protesting, what were they protesting for? How did they expand those rights? Protesting in litigation, legislation, and in the streets, or individually, wherever that might be. What we're seeing now is a backlash to our progress based on all that hard work. That backlash to Obama's 2 terms is Trump. Okay, the backlash to a Black female vice president is another Trump. Yeah. Okay, so but it's always 2 steps forward and 1 step back. That's been our entire history. We've said that before. It's 2 steps forward and 1 step back. So we put the conscience in the Constitution through our litigation. But now they feel they are victims of equality. That's my phrase. Give me attribution when you use it again. They are victims of equality because of the rise of women, because of the rise of people of color. And they said, well, I can't guarantee to my grandchild what I had. Well, maybe you shouldn't have had what you had back then.
And that whole discussion, as you know, Professor Brown Marshall, of in the Oversight Committee, of them discussing this presentation of a proposed law about dismantling DEI. It's been ongoing. You've probably seen in the news and in conversation, and on C-SPAN.
It's for all means and purposes, it is dismantled. And going forward,
yes.
And I have friends who DEI. The class
I hate to say it like that, but I am in agreement.
Yes, I mean, I teach a race and law class that would not be legal in Florida and many other states for me to teach. Which
leads me to one of the questions I have, which is a modern day challenge as it ties to like constitutional implications. So in this instance, what you just brought up. So like, what are the constitutional implications of efforts to ban the teaching of critical race theory or restrict discussions of race in schools? What are the constitutional implications of that?
So this is a federalism question, right? Because the Constitution does not
doesn't touch on it. It doesn't physically speak about it, but you have your federalistic pieces that are within, as we talked about, all these additional documents.
Right. And so the federal government, and this is what President Trump is, and some of his, well, I don't even think he has the brain power to do this, but some of the allies that he's in community with are pushing.
His allies
are trying to get rid of the Department of Education because it is not it's not a part of the bureaucracy that was framed when the framers of the Constitution were thinking about education. That wasn't it. So, but there's lots of other things that the framers weren't thinking about, not just the Department of Education, but nevertheless, here we are. So what we see here is the difference in how states have the power, again, granted to them than anything that's not written into the Constitution. So there's a Department of Education in each state that has autonomy over what their students learn, the resources that they're able to use. and the kind of the metrics that students will be weighted against. The federal government's responsibility then is to use kind of like the carrot and stick approach, right? So they're using tax money that is raised by the federal government to redistribute to the states in terms of block grants or other kinds of other mechanisms that transfer money from the federal government to the states if those states are in compliance. And so the difference I think that we will most likely see, I think it'll be much harder to get rid of the Department of Education, but instead I think what we'll see are difference in how federal funds are flowing to particular state departments of education that are adhering to a philosophy that the Trump administration would like. And so I think and the reason why I think the Department of Education is targeted, not just for some of the reasons that you hear some Republicans and those who have fidelity to Trump kind of parroting, but rather because the Biden administration has used the Department of Education to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that was a vehicle that the administration used in order to try to kind of equalize the playing ground, right? And it was an opportunity that or a mechanism that executive powers can take to leverage over policymaking when they know that they don't have the votes and the ability to do so in Congress. And so I think this is much more of a partisan, like football.
Absolutely.
Than it is.
It's a game.
Yes, yes.
It's a game.
But also the Department of Education, and that, thank you for that explanation. The Department of Education also has a civil rights division. And as somebody who worked in my prior life on school desegregation cases that involve children in public schools, as well as administrators, Black administrators and other administrators of color, and principals, librarians, et cetera, and the resources. And so the Civil Rights Division was one that was overseeing whether or not the resources were equal. Going back to the issue that was raised, and Jason, I'm sure from Wilberforce can talk about the fact that there are still HBCUs that did not receive the funding they were supposed to receive from their state governments. And so the Civil Rights Division within the Department of Education was also part of, lawsuits to oversee the division of that funding. And so they want to also get rid of the lawyers who are working in the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Education as well. But the other question about banning books, et cetera, is one that in the lawsuits, it's been a First Amendment issue. And the First Amendment issue was, can the government actually ban someone from going to the library to check out a book, and at what age? And what they were saying was in Texas and other places, they had committees that decided if your book had race in the title, if it had queer in the title, if it had any of these different things in the title, then it was banned. It was considered, The Bluest Eye was banned, James Patterson's books were banned. And it got to the point where at this point, if you go to PEN America, PEN America, I'm a member, for full disclosure, of PEN America, it's an organization of writers. They will, tell you that over 10,000 books have been banned across this country. These successful lawsuits have been based on First Amendment rights as well as on academic freedom. And that's, is still precariously situated as to whether or not academic freedom is going to allow teachers to continue to teach subjects. And I'll give this anecdotal example. I was a Black History speaker last year in Florida. I was there the day after the president of one of the colleges was dismissed, summarily dismissed. I was there the next day. I was given a list of words I could not say in my presentation. This is real. A list I could not say. There were people in the room. It was recorded. And I knew those who had invited me would lose their job if I decided, well, I'm going to just say these things anyway. So instead of racism, I use the R word. It's like, and it's gotten that bad. So we're here in certain places able to have an academic conversation about this, but this is a reality that many people are living with every day, where we have to ask ourselves, who is now going to get their doctorate in Black studies if there's no future in it?
Right.
Then what are we losing here? I mean, I want you to think about African American literature. I want you to think about all these disciplines where they are actively fighting any type of footing for us and getting rid of those that are there, getting rid of whole departments. Because for those of you in academia, you know that, it's very difficult to get rid of a tenured professor. I'm a tenured full professor. However, if they get rid of the whole department, they can do that. And so when we're thinking about how this wave of anti-DEI is playing out, it's well beyond this conversation where people are sitting in a room thinking of every aspect of equality, because as I said, they believe they're victims of equality and that they are losing hold of their country. And it goes back to what Jason said early on. It's about fear, whether or not we call it fear of a Black planet. We call it fear of 2045. And I said 2045 instead of 2050 because, but I knew 15 years ago that 2045 was coming. And before that, it was actually 2060.
Correct.
And it's really escalated that because of the birth rate that's taking place and the low birth rate.
It's shortened. Yes, correct.
And that nationalism is not the first time they've done this, but is also because of the fewer white babies. And that's so obviously part of why they want to ban access to abortion and other types of healthcare, is because they want more white babies.
Legislator Richburg, I know you wanted to say something, and I do actually have a question for you from the audience as well.
So I have a couple. So when we think of the Department of Education, we think of education as everything being sat in the Department of Education, and that's actually not true, right? So there's also a civil rights division in the Department of Justice, right? But all of our schools are funded by multiple, the National Education Foundation, the EPA, a number of other sources. So when we talk about the attacks on education, you should be looking at all of those departments, not just one, even the USDA, because the USDA actually also feeds our school lunch program. So, and a number of other things. So that's how we should look at it when we talk about education. I'll also add that, recently, and I think recently as in last week, the House just approved a bill that allowed the IRS to make not certain nonprofits, terrorist organizations, right? So you have to add all of it.
HR 9495.
Right. It's going to the Senate. It probably won't pass in the Senate, but it doesn't mean it won't pass next year, right?
That's correct.
And so these are things when you talk about attacks and terrorism and DEI, it's a going back to what was said earlier. It's a cornucopia of destruction in some respects. But when you go back to states' rights, right? Certain states have education, again, like New York State has education in the Constitution, and so that's why those things are important. We had a conversation earlier about the Black elites, right? In some respects, the communities feel like the Black elites have left them, right? As was stated before. And we have, especially among Black men, one of the lowest graduation rates from higher education. And it does precipitously lower when you talk about advanced degrees. So how do we combine those two and those different? How do we use the Black collective to go back and say, listen, we need to invest in higher education. We need to invest in our own schools. In some places in Florida, what the churches have done is start building that African American Studies program back into the churches. I can say that some members of Kappa Alpha Psi have started doing that in our Kappa League programs. So it's going back to that approach and figuring out how we can change it to fit what we need. And I'm sorry, you had a question.
I do have a question for you, and this is coming from the audience, Legislator Richburg. It is the following.
No problem.
With the infighting that is happening with the Republican power, do we see that helping regain a balance in the federal government eventually?
My response would be yes, and here's why. So while there is a majority, in the House, it's a very slim majority, which means everyone has to be present and everyone has to agree.
Correct.
And so And that's how we lost. That's not how we lost. That's how the last speaker was removed, right? Because it was such a slim majority in the House that one person had the power to remove the speaker, right? And so there's going to be a delicate balance as to what can be done in the House, right? And knowing that while they have a majority in the Senate, it's a 2-vote, I believe, majority in the Senate.
Correct.
So you're really going to be on a razor thin edge on most of the policies, which is why you saw a lot of senators revolting on certain appointees by the incoming administration, right? Because they know that an individual senator from wherever can have more power than possibly a congressman in this respect. And so that is important. Now, what does that say for policy going forward? You have seen that any seat that has been a majority or is won by a slim majority, whether Democrat or Republican, that is the lobbying point. You will see people in different parts of our country, some parts in California, some parts in Texas, some parts in Virginia, where they will probably be the most powerful people in either party because of this slim majority. And that is how, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, that is how you're going to be able to get some of these things done, and that's how you're going to have to stem the tide. And I'll also go back. There was a question about the Department of Education quickly. One of the reasons why the Department of Education was founded is because it was seen that the United States was falling far behind
Correct.
other nations, other modern nations in education outcomes.
Let's just call out that the Department of Education is only 45 years old.
Right. It was founded. It was founded in 1979. And we don't have despite what folks say, we do not have a federal education system.
That's correct.
We do not. I'll say it again, just in case the folks in the back.
Please, wait, say it again. Say it again. One more time. One more time for the masses.
We do not have a federalized education system. Other modern nations.
No, say one more time. Say one more time.
We do not have a federalized education system.
Thank you.
Higher education or lower education, right? Secondary education, elementary education. There are standards, but it's not an education system. And that is why 8th grade in New York is different than 8th grade in Texas.
Correct.
If you want to learn about the founding of the country, go to 50 states, you'll have 50 different stories.
Thank you.
So basically, just to make it even clearer, the right to an education is not in the U.S. Constitution. So just that's make it very, very
Thank you,
clear.
Professor Brown Marshall. Yes, let's just put it all in layman's terms. Yes, bingo. I have a question for everyone here. I have this question coming in. It says the following. Can the Constitution truly define who can be qualified to be president? It seems like anyone can run for the most powerful seat, but we have seen mediocrity.
I mean, frankly, I think generally speaking, I think it's a good thing that we have low bars to the presidency. I mean, what, you have to be 35, you have to be a citizen, and besides not have engaged in insurrection, I'll pull that one out there. But I think otherwise maybe there's a residency requirement, but it's pretty easy to be president. I think that's a good thing because I don't think that Trump's election or his mediocrity, which I presume, I'm going to put myself and say that's what I think they were referencing, it somehow shows the system isn't working. I think what it shows is it's a kind of a mirror to the American people. Like, we can only be as great as we want to be. So I think the presidents we choose, including Trump, reflect our values as a nation, reflect our priorities as a nation, for better and, in my view, for worse. But I don't think the answer would have been a system that has more requirements. I think what that tends to do is preserve power for the already powerful, right? Because when you add more requirements, you're not adding a more democratic approach to sharing power. It's going to be barriers to entry, which is going to aid those that are in power. So I think if we have an issue with mediocrity, I think we often need to look, either to our neighbor or into the mirror as to why we had that mediocrity.
Yeah, so I would double tap on this comment there, that it's not necessarily the Constitution's low bar of just being 35 years old and a citizen, but it's political parties, right? Political parties are the avenue in which candidates should be selected, recruited, supported, and quality of candidates are vetted through political parties. So what we've seen in not just the presidency, right, but all levels of government, we've seen political parties perhaps put up some questionable people and not support some really great people. And so my research, my area of expertise is Black women legislators. And what I've been doing this work for over almost 15 years. And every single woman, with the exception of 3 that I've interviewed over my career, have talked about the ways that the Republican Party and the Democratic Party have not done a good job in supporting them. And it goes down to resources. So it's the money to run a campaign. It's listening to them and taking them seriously when they're telling the party what they need on the ground. They're telling them what their constituents are saying, right?
And I wanted to add in, unfortunately, there is that stigma and the stereotype, in particular for women who want to get into politics, no matter what their racial or socioeconomic background is very eye-opening to hear this from those that I've spoken with who have run for office and what they've encountered in the space.
Right. And in some ways, this is a uniquely American thing because of the way
Yes.
the political parties work and the more decentralized and diffuse nature where parties are super powerful in some places and then really not powerful in others. And so if we don't like, let's say, the candidates that are being presented to us, we could also think about ways that everyday citizens have the opportunity to influence political parties. And so that's by joining them, that's by donating to them, that is by engaging with the political process. And so if we know that parties are the ones that are typically charged with recruiting and promoting candidates, if we're dissatisfied with the candidates that are there, political parties might be a faster, a venue to go to change that. The other option is run yourself, right? And so I always put that out there. That's usually my last lecture for my class is to get people to think about running for office themselves. And perhaps legislator Rich Berg could talk a little bit about this, about your experience running for office, being recruited, and the roles that you do. But I think part of it is in our communities kind of demystifying what the process is to become an elected official. We know and we see a lot of the grassroots organizers, those that are on the ground doing the day-to-day work in the community. And what sometimes is more opaque is that transition from doing the work in the community to now moving into an elected office space.
So, I mean, I guess I can jump in. Unfortunately, my Councilmember Brooks isn't here to even join in on this discussion because I think we have 2 similar views. We both were staffers beforehand,
Yes,
and so
y'all both
the
were.
one thing, I'm extremely proud of Councilmember Brooks and her rise and her council going through this process. I will say, Dr. Brown, the one thing I will say is that it is hard for a person of color, a Black man as well, to do fundraising. And I'm not saying, and here's what I will say first. I don't tell people to run for office. Here's why. I tell you I need staff. I tell you I need analysts. I need budget officers. I need policymakers. I need folks who are architects who want to be road planners. I need urban planners. I need environmentalists. I need attorneys. I need 15,000 other jobs. I am a county legislator for 1.5 million people and a $4.3 billion budget. And I can go into multiple rooms and not see a Black person. And I will say that I am the fourth African-American elected or Black person elected to the legislature. And I still go to parts of this county where they said they never seen a Black legislator. Now, to be fair, the first Black legislator was elected in 2005. And so I am the fourth, and there was a point in time where there was at least two at the same time. And I worked as a clerk. I was a chief of staff to a county legislator, to the second African-American legislator, and the first presiding officer, which is like our speaker of the House. So I will say that we need staff. The other thing I'll say to us is that voting is not enough. We have this idea that I voted every 4 years and that's it. Elections happen all the time. And folks say, well, I don't like who the party chose. Well, did you show up to a party convention? Did you become a committee person? Well, I just want to run and I want to take a forget about a delegate. Like, did you work in your county precinct to knock on, or your legislative area to knock on doors to get folks elected?
Right.
So we have this, while we have this very expansive conversation about policy and the Constitution, we don't have enough of us in the room to make sure that we're getting people to the other side.
So
we don't have enough Black district attorneys. I mean, or Black, ADAs. Pick one. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
With you just saying that, Legislator Richburg, how do you? I hate to say it like this. How do you make these type of positions attractive to?
I guess. May I just add this one point?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's great. Before you get to the attractive part, as somebody who's been in and out of this since high school, and has been asked to run for office more than once and decided not to, the way you set out your need for staff was the first time that it was clear what was needed. And I think that there are so many people who I know at my college and other places who can then visualize that. And I've known people who were staffers, but there's this disconnect between how one goes from their whatever expertise they had during their college or post-college days into being a staffer. So maybe before it might be into the question you were saying, Danielle. But
it does go into the question, Professor Brown Marshall. Like, what I mean by that is, like, okay, he stated you need staff, right? So how do you expand on that overall visual and explanation of what the need is? I don't think a lot of people these days have a full understanding of the need that's wanted within their be it their local government, their state government, their all of the things. I think people think it's like unattainable. So how do we ensure?
Or they don't even know it exists.
And then there's that part.
So I was gonna add into this is what I kind of share. So I think the larger overall point, right, that I'm trying to make, and I think it agrees Max on well with Senator Richburg, is that there's multiple entry points into the political process, right? And the idea is, rather than to think about voting as the thing that you do that says that you're political, there's so many other avenues that I think that we could all be doing a better job of explaining to people and talking about. So we are, I think, more and more clear in this past decade that democracy is not transactional, or should not be transactional, right? And that if you can vote, you can also show up to petition your legislator to follow up with the things that he or she said that they were going to do. But outside of that, right, I think it's a way in which we can reorient ourselves to the political process. And so, yes, there are those needs for those positions to be filled. But it's, again, like talking to our like bright students who they come, at least for me, come to Georgetown and they're like, oh, I want to be a Supreme Court justice. And that's what there's in their mind, right? And so they have a very clear path ticked out to become a justice, but less so for people who are just like, well, I'm taking all these Black studies courses or women's and gender studies courses, and I find these things interesting. And I only thing I think I can do is, work for an NGO. But there are other opportunities. So some of that is exposing and having opportunities to hear from people like Legislator Richburg. But I think one of the other things that was very apparent to me and during the 2020 election was that there was such a need for Black communities to talk about the power of fundraising, right? And what money plays in politics. And the mantra around voting, voting, voting should also be vote and also donate, right? And explaining the promise and explaining donation, right?
But
Donate.
it's also twofold. And what I mean by that, besides vote and donate, but a continuance of education on outside, expanding on the importance of voting, and then also expanding on the importance of donating.
Right. And it's something we don't do necessarily as well in our community.
And I know that very well. In my past life, I was a development person. I worked in fundraising heavy, and I did not see us in the space, right? So it's something
nor are
that,
we advisors to campaigns.
and then there's
to your
that
point.
part. Dr. Brown Marshall, you're on mute. I know you wanted to say something.
No, but here's the thing, to put it in, I don't want to be a nerd, but to put
Please
it in
do. Oh, please. It's okay. We all nerds. We're all nerds here.
When we just think about putting this in historical context, when Legislator Richburg was talking about 2005, we're still new to this game. We are learning fast.
Yes.
But we're still new because we were shut out for so long that we're trying to
we're not put in these spaces. And can I also tap in regards to even because of a stereotype and stigma of looking at Black people as individuals you cannot trust with money, in particular, even Black men. I'm going to put it out there, okay? Because we even have in the past our own Black organizations not hiring development people, looking towards Caucasian individuals as a trusting face to raise the money and to acquire the funds. So this is an even more like internal conversation, another type of real talk.
I would agree, but I'd also come with some of the growth, right? So we can think about, again, in the last 10 years, the creation of organizations like the Black PAC or Higher Heights, right?
That's right.
She the People.
And even Win with Black Women.
Yes, Win with Black Women. That was just 4 years old, right? And so the promise part of that part, I think, that was mentioned about earlier, that the arc of the universe, long arc of the universe bends towards justice, is that there is some movement, right? And so not recognizing that, some of, let's say, the historical organizations, civil rights organizations haven't been as present in the space, and then now new organizations have popped up. Or organizations like ours, right? Delta has opened up a C4, right? So they're able to contribute to candidates. So there's growth, and and there are ways, but it doesn't mean just because we were late to the game that it's not going to happen.
It's
so
gonna happen, but it takes
I'm
time.
just deeply pessimistic about a lot of things.
But we also have to be aggressive with it.
Right. But that part, right? It's going to happen, but we have to put the energy and effort into it.
If I could just add that Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority is also,
thank you. Thank you. Bring it in. Yes.
Bring my sorors to the fore.
That's right.
But I want to go back to something that Legislator Richburg was saying.
Yes.
And that is, he needs all these things. And that's what popped in my head. How do we... I know what I do with my classes. We actually called Chuck Schumer's office, Senator Schumer's office, and I say, I want you to have an issue. I want you to call them, whether or not it's immigration, if it's student loans, whatever it is, call the office. I want you to hear what the response is. I want you to know that the person who's answering the phone, you could be one of those people, and that you too could be someone who's responsible to the community. I asked them during the winter intercession, go volunteer for someone in elected office. I mean, I just want to know, how do we bridge that gap? Because if people don't even know that they are needed in these offices, that they can gain these skills, then you're not going to get Legislator Richburg the support that you need on all levels, because there are also people who are retired who might want to help.
So Professor Brown Marshall and Dr. Brown, here, no offense to you all, but I will tell you that don't call the federal government. Stop. I know it's a constitutional conversation, but all politics is local. All government is local.
That's right.
And so we need, and I know folks say, I want to be a Supreme Court justice. We just elected a congresswoman who started off as a county executive in a county. So local government is the pipeline to leadership. And that has always been the design of local government. And, you know, I go to the National Association of Counties meetings every year. I try to, and you see how many people have moved from, you know, whether a county office to a state office to a federal government. And I would tell your folks in your classrooms, number one, whatever job you have, literally, if you are a delivery person from Amazon, you could do that for your local government, because they have couriers, okay? If you cut grass on the side, you could be a landscaper for the county or the city, okay? If you plant flowers, if you are a horticulturalist, they have whole towns and villages and cities that have horticulturalists, right? If you are a business development person, you can work in business development in your local government or your state government. So, and what we need to do, and going back to that education conversation, is our education system does not talk about our local government. It doesn't. When I was a clerk of the legislature, so just so folks know, Suffolk County was founded before the founding of the United States. So I was the clerk of the legislature, and so I sat in a seat with literally a person who was my predecessor, not direct, signed the state constitution, designed the Montauk Lighthouse, and signed the U.S. Constitution. So I've done nothing in my life compared to that person, right? But the number one thing we brought school districts into, and I had a history professor, I had a government teacher who didn't know what the county did, had no clue what county government does, had no clue what the town government does. And I know some folks are from New York City, so you guys don't understand the difference between local zoning and the like, and local control when it comes to towns and villages and counties. But that's a huge issue, because I know that they're not teaching what New York City Council does, right? I know they're not talking what the Westchester County Legislature does. And so we need to bridge those gaps and have those internships. So one of the things we did, and you know, my predecessor, Dwayne Gregory, we created the PAGE program. So we had a summer internship program modeled off of some other internship programs where you worked in the county. And so all of my interns, when I was there, I had them build a budget. So they built a $4 billion budget every summer. So I had 15 kids, or 25 kids. That's what they did. So that's something you're not going to learn in a classroom. And if you don't adopt your budget, and if you don't do your structures, you're going to have to do layoffs, right? So then you had to adopt your layoffs, right? And then we had to have people come in and go to the legislature and call them all types of names, because nobody can follow you up with that, because you didn't adopt your budget. So now you have to let go of staff. The other thing we do is and I will add that anybody here who is moderate to low income can go to your youth job corps or with the Department of Labor, and you can get a position with them and ask them to work in your local government, and you can get paid, especially if you're a senior in high school.
Thank you, Legislator Richburg. In talking about DOE, we're going to touch on it again. And I do have another question to tie this all together and wrap us up for the evening. But there was a question that came in about how will the dismantling of the DOE affect aid for students? That's the first part of the question. And then the second part, which I thought was interesting, but I'm not sure how it ties, but someone could provide information if you have it. Will the NCAA, who makes billions, now be required to help schools with aid, not just sports programs? That's the second part of that question that was asked. How will the dismantling of the DOE affect aid for students? And will the NCAA, who makes billions, now be required to help schools with aid, not just sports programs?
I guess so. I guess what the first part of the question, the issue would be it takes off some regulatory controls, right? And some of the regulatory controls that even are in the finance department that have been dismantled over the last couple of Supreme Court decisions. I think, you can see higher interest rates on loans. I think you're going to see less aid possibly and more loans and more, higher interest loans as
And
well.
the gutting of
In terms
Pell
of
Grants.
and the gutting of Pell Grants. I can see that.
And
Unless you have some
subsidized
sort of a
loans.
state-based program. Right. So because all of those are regulatory functions that come from the Department of Education. In terms of the NCAA point, I would say that was part of the name, image, and likeness, lawsuit. And the fact to give the money back to the students. I think part of the issue is when you talk about the NCAA, that really is only covering most of the sports. It's not covering football. So you won't see that aid would go to the schools. I think you're probably going to see a increase in under the table money probably, and you'll probably see an increase in gambling, and you'll probably, with the gutting of the Department of Justice, we'll probably see some more real big issues when it comes to point shaving and some other things that can happen in different sports.
I also wanted to add in regards to the dismantling of the DOE, the repercussions is especially if you do have a child with developmental issues, the DOE is in place to assist in helping see about mapping out your IEP for your child. Be it any type, the appropriate testing for your child or children. If needed, to gauge that specific need, that specific developmental need. They are advocating, are the in place advocates to ensure that these things are being done. So now you as a parent will be responsible to ensure that you have an appropriate learning development plan in place for your child. So
I think there's also going to be a breakdown of the wall between public schools and religious schools.
Yes.
And because that's been a point of conflict for at least 2 generations.
Correct.
I mean, after Brown v. Board of Education, we saw this creation of the religious schools, but most of those religious schools had tuition. And so that's been the ire of many of these parents. They did not want their children going to school with people of color. They wanted them to go to these, standalone religious schools. They didn't like paying the tuition. And little by little, I think that the Supreme Court has been, expanding these religious rights in other areas. And so we could see this expansion as well, allowing for these religious schools to then get money from the federal government and the state governments that they were not receiving before to offset the tuition.
Thank you. And my final question.
I think, to that point, Dr. Brown Marshall, I could also say that any of those property taxes in local governments and local school districts can possibly then be sent over. So you could see a degradation of local education that way too.
Correct. Thank you, Legislator Richburg. My final question to everyone here, and then we will conclude. It's a very rich question, but I think it's something that needs to be asked. What parts of the Constitution would you suggest that young men women learn more about to protect their rights as we embark into 2025?
I think oh, go ahead.
No, I'll make mine very quick. The Constitution is interpreted by the U.S. Supreme Court. And so reading the 14th Amendment doesn't really tell you all you have as rights or protections, because when a case comes before the court, they look at precedent, the established case law, and supposedly apply these precedents to the case before them, the facts before them. So I think it's difficult to just, for me, to just look at a provision. I would say look at the 14th Amendment, but then also look at the cases that are being decided by the U.S. Supreme Court that involve the 14th Amendment. My major concern is the Constitution gives us access to the courts. So whether or not it's looking at a state case, a county case, you can sit in and watch the court in action. You could go to the U.S. Supreme Court and see them in action, see them listening to oral arguments, making their decisions, etc. The court opens their term the first week of October, ends at the end of April, and during the month of June, that's when they reveal their decisions, and then they escape.
For the summer, yeah.
Yes. But I think we need to pay more attention to the U.S. Supreme Court and to the cases, and the fact that we haven't paid as much attention, which has been, like my nerdy self, it's been something I've been talking about for 20 years, is paying more attention to the U.S. Supreme Court and following their decision making, and seeing them with a supermajority of conservatives actually dismantle the rights that we assumed we had under the Constitution. So you can read the 14th Amendment. That's the same amendment that gave us affirmative action and took it away. So just reading the words can't tell you what the interpretation of that amendment is going to be. We have to actually also file the cases. And there are so many ways online to do that. And if I might mention, Your Democracy is an animated series that I wrote and was produced by WHYY, an NPR affiliate out of Philadelphia. Your Democracy is 10 episodes, 5 to 7 minutes each, on the Constitution, free of charge, no licensing. It's available on whyy.org, and it's also available on YouTube to be used by teachers, used in families everywhere. I created this for my nerdy self so that people would be able to learn more about the Constitution, and it's animated. So any organization, please, you can put it on your website. You don't have to get any license or permission to use this service.
Thank you. Anyone else? Dr. Brown, I know you were going to say something.
Yeah, so I would state that for many people who are disappointed in the presidential election, feel tired, feel burnt out, feel disheartened, this doesn't stop life, right? It doesn't stop political life. And right, research shows that Gen Z are some of the most politically active generations. They're outpacing their older predecessors, millennials, Gen X,
Yes.
and even some boomers when they were this age. And so I want to share that for some people, this might be disappointing, but this is a time to regroup and to focus on the comeback after you take some time to rest and recalibrate for yourself. As legislator Richburg noted, you know, it's not just a focus on national government. It should be a focus on state and local government as well. And there is time, space, and opportunity in these next 4 years for capacity building. And so rather than being reactive, we can think about being responsive. And in order to be responsive, we have to know we have to know policy. We need to know what you need to know what the Constitution says. You need to know what your state constitution says. You need to be able to know who the leaders are in your community so that you are well informed about the policies and procedures, and then also how to enact change for things you don't like. And so this is not a sprint. This is, again, like this long march towards democracy. And we need everyone, so I hope the lights don't go off. I need everyone to be active participants. In order to do that, you need to preserve your health, your sanity, your bodies, so that you can continue on.
Thank you. Any other additional closing remarks from the panel?
It was great being with you all, and I don't have much to add with all that. One thing I would say in this moment, I was a federal prosecutor. I'd focused on Jan 6, working for Congress and the committee, and I've thought a lot about the federal government as a lawyer, and that's where my practice now is more focused on that. And I'm not a guy who's thought about state level work really ever, because it's just where not my practice has been. But one thing I will say that in the aftermath of the election loss and thinking about, frankly, years of my professional life with the Jan 6 committee kind of coming to a waste to some degree, one thing that's given me some comfort is the turning somewhat inward and to be thinking about the community around, to be thinking about, and one way to think about that is the state level, to think about the local level, to think about how I can be more involved in Brooklyn, where I live, in a way that so much of my professional thinking has always been about, the
bigger pie.
The bigger pie. And I clerked for a federal judge, and I Department of Justice, and these are all the things that my career has been about. And I don't have a lot of faith or, I don't have a silver lining about what's coming. Frankly, I think it's all going to be bad, and there is no silver lining, and people should brace themselves. I don't think there is a silver lining in my, that's pessimistic, but that's what I do believe. But the thing that I've taken as my personal silver lining is the value of the smaller community, of the local community, of the fact that I feel fortunate to be in Brooklyn. And if I was going to encourage anyone to take it when we talk about federalism, part of that is, as the legislator said, looking to your local government, looking to your local communities. And I think I would encourage that.
Thank you so much. And Legislative Richburg, did you have something you wanted to add before I turn it over to our lovely Polmark?
Yeah, I don't want to get in front of Polmark King, but I'll just he has a bit more deference than I do. But I'll just say that if you live in an area where people look and think like you, then I would ask that you adopt an area where they don't. So if you live in an area where everybody votes in the same direction that you vote in, then you should volunteer in an area where you don't. You can take a 20-minute drive or an hour drive in a different direction and make a change there. Because if you're in an area where you all agree, then you're sitting in an echo chamber and you don't know what's going on outside. And that is a problem, because we all live in a bubble and we stay in that bubble and thinking that that bubble is where we should all belong. And that's not true. We got to get uncomfortable, because democracy is about a fight for all of us. And that means you have to get active and not get comfortable.
And I'd also like to just touch on that. Yes, we are a democracy, but our government is technically a republic. So there are ebbs and flows and changes to it, which has a fusion of democratic values and procedure. But we are a republic. So I just wanted to say that. To the panel, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Dr. Brown Marshall, Dr. Brown, Legislator Richburg, and Mr. Agunga Williams, Esquire. Thank you all for this engaging conversation. I hope we'll be able to do it again, because this is just Civics 101. This is the base, and we need to continue this conversation. And I thank the Brooklyn, Long Island alumni chapter of Kappa Alpha Psi fraternity for having me as their moderator. And with that, I am going to turn this over to Polmark King for remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thank you all. Good evening. My name is Mario King, and I'm the 27th Polmark of the Brooklyn, Long Island chapter of Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity Incorporated. On behalf of the Brooklyn, Long Island alumni chapter, we thank Dr. Henry for moderating this awesome session, the panelists for joining and sharing insightful information and empowering us as a community and regarding the education and civil liberties ahead of the upcoming year. We thank you, the viewers, and encourage you to follow us on our socials and YouTube to hear more information about our exciting topics in the future Real Talk series aimed at empowering our community. Again, I think Dr. Henry said it best. This is just the beginning of our civil liberties and information that we're sharing today. So I think, quite honestly, this has been an awesome session for our community, and we look forward to sharing more. Until then, I encourage you to stay informed and stay active. Thank you.